So again, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the WSPS Health and Safety Connection. The Safety Connections are a series of webinars that we complete on a variety of different topics. Today's topic is awareness versus training in health and safety. We're going to kind of go a little bit deeper into that. My name is Martin, or Marty. I go by both, so don't be shy. You can use either one of them. And again, today's presentation is around what the difference is between awareness and training in health and safety. So we're just going to go through a few housekeeping issues just to get started. Just to let you know, this session is scheduled for an hour and a half, but this might take an hour, might take an hour and a half, depends on questions, depends on conversation that we have, also depends on how quickly I speak. So this is for you though, so please, if you have any questions, don't wait till the end, just throw them into the chat as we go, and we'll do our best to respond to them as we're going. So again, welcome everybody and happy Monday morning. So just to start off, there's a little disclaimer that we have that these are included in all of them. Another thing that's in there is also you don't see, but AI is not something that we accept in these kind of situations. It does prompt a lot and create some situations there, but this is how we go about doing things. And now the next slide is the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training and Skills Development likes to collect demographic data. It's anonymous. Nothing is collected from individuals, but the point is to try to figure out who's participating, how we can improve it, what targeting demographics we should consider in the future, for example, new and young workers or seasoned workers, things like that. So the purpose is to collect some data to see how we're delivering to employers and workers in Ontario. So you can click the link, it'll be available. You might not have time to do it now, so you can do it at your convenience. Of course, it's optional, so it's up to you to do that. So that's there, and it'll be, so you'll see it's in the chat as well. So please again do that at your convenience. We won't have time to go through it today. And then so just to give you again a little bit more housekeeping issues. So before we get started, we recommend you use your computer audio with headphones, but your phone conference audio is available. And the phone conference audio details can be found in the access email that you received. Everyone's camera and microphones will be muted and off for the session. So this is all just again available in the chat. So with Microsoft Teams, there's a number of different ways to get engaged. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with it, but if you're not, there's reactions. You can do thumbs up. There's if you look along the menu bar at the top, there's a little smiley face that says react underneath it. You can click on that. All right, I see a thumbs up already. Thank you. And then from there, we will be doing a few polls today. The one thing about the polls is sometimes internal security requirements don't allow for the links and to do the polls. And if that's the case, you can just throw your answer into the chat as well. But if you can, and again, we have the meeting chat that's open as well, and you can just use that to ask questions or make comments or even support. This is for all of us. I'm the host, I'm the facilitator, but if you have questions, you have comments, there's, I've been at this long enough to know that there's a breadth of experience out there and a lot of great ways to do things, and health and safety can be done lots of different ways. So please don't be shy. As far as accessibility features, you can enable those by clicking on the three dots, or the ellipsis, I believe it's called. You can click on language and speech. You can turn on live captions, whatever, that function that works best for you, or you can even actually move to full screen as an option. Again, what's the purpose of the Safety Connections? Well, there's a lot of information about health and safety out there. Sometimes it's easy to find, sometimes it's not. So we like to facilitate these sessions to try to discuss topics that are of interest or top of mind or important in the province for employers and for workers. So, and it's also an opportunity to connect with some of your peers. There's some other people in the chat that you'll see that you can, see who's available. Again, it's, up to you to share or not share. These are facilitated sessions. They're not training sessions, even though we're talking about training here today. And you can attend from home, from your own workspace, wherever you're at. So the goal is to help inform people and to facilitate some learning. So before we get started, just a quick little background. I don't want to bore you too much, but again, my name is Martin, or Marty. I grew up in a small town in Northern Ontario called Elliott Lake. When I was growing up, Elliott Lake was the uranium capital of the world. So my first job in safety happened to be in the safety department in the mines. And I'll tell a little bit more about Elliott Lake later on because it is relevant to what we're talking about. My father spent 25 years as a justice of the peace in the province of Ontario. And my mother spent 30 years as an occupational health and safety nurse. I have two brothers that worked as consultants in health and safety. I've been with WSPS for 13 years. I've been doing this consistently for 20 years though. So again, don't want to bore you too much, but that's a quick little overview of what I'm doing. So today's session, we're going to start off by going over a little bit of legislation and providing the introduction. Then we're going to talk about what's the difference between awareness and training and where does it apply. And then we're actually going to go through a few topics that are very relevant, that happens all the time, that I get questions as. I'm a health and safety account manager for WSPS, and my job is a direct relationship management perspective with clients. So a lot of times we have questions and we some little bit of guidance, find resources, give options, things like that. So some of the questions that we get, the ones that come up the most often for awareness and training, is some of the ones we're going to try to review today. So again, first to module 1, what's the primary objective for health and safety? What's the context and application? And then a quick review of the legislation and some of the references. We're not going to get too deep in legislation, but this is, after all, oftentimes mandated and a requirement for employers and workers to comply. So we're going to get into that. But before we do that, even though we're going to talk about legislation, let's just remember what the main purpose of health and safety is, and that's to prevent fatalities, to prevent critical injuries and injuries to people, and and even to the business itself, right? So it's easy to get caught up in lots of different things, policies, procedures, all those kind of things, requirements, whether we have to, we don't have to. But when in doubt, just remember the purpose of the health and safety is to make sure nobody gets seriously injured. So, and my goal for this session is that if you finish the session and you think everything that you're doing or your employer is doing is fantastic, then that's wonderful. Keep doing it. Keep moving forward. If not, then consider changing something. Change the way that you approach things. Maybe convert some awareness to training, or even go the other way if you find that that's the best way to apply it to your business. So the goal at the end is to do something with this information, not just to go through the process, okay? So again, if I didn't say it already, if you have questions, put them in the chat as we go. Don't wait till the end. We'll get into a few more topics soon, so you might have more relevance that way. So one more time, we're going to talk about legislation, we're going to talk about responsibility, we're talking things about that, but everyone deserves the right to go home safely at the end of their day, right? So yes, of course, employers have liability and responsibility, so do workers, everything like that. But, the goal is to make sure everybody goes home. We work safely together. And again, this is where I was going to mention Elliott Lake. This is also known as the internal responsibility system. So when I was growing up in Elliott Lake, so just to get this out of there, I'm old. So this was in the 70s and 80s. In the late 60s and early 70s, the miners working in the mines underground were starting to get sick from breathing in all the dust. So year after year, they would go and complain to the mine owners, and they were told, don't worry about it, go back to work, we'll take care of it. Then eventually in 1974, they went on what's called a wildcat strike. A wildcat strike's illegal. So that called in the police. The police realized it was a labor issue. They called the Ministry of Labor. The Ministry of Labor appointed a gentleman by the name of Dr. James Ham at the time, and he spent a year reviewing the situation, completed what's called a Ham Commission report that's still available online. But two main findings from that were, one, the requirement for the formation of joint labor and management teams, which became Section 9 Joint Health and Safety Committees in 1979, and for the concept and the application of the internal responsibility system, which means everybody that works in the business has a responsibility towards health and safety. Yes, there's different roles, there's different levels of authority, but we all should work together. We all should try to support each other and making sure that nobody gets hurt and we can all do our job safely and go home. So that's a little history of Elliott Lake, and again, that's where I grew up. So, and also, again, one more time, we're going to talk about legislation, but legislation is the minimum. So that's the starting point. You need to start with the minimum. You need to meet the minimum, but please don't stop there. Go beyond. Some of the language I use is, over-determined success where it matters most. And we're going to get into a little later on where it matters most and how to make that determination. We'll, veer off in a little bit of a different process. But please don't stop at the minimum. That's just a guide. That's the starting point. Keep going, especially when you have high risk. Any questions so far? All right, we'll keep going. So again, I'm just gonna, I got a thumbs up, excellent. Thank you for that. So a little bit of legislation. So for employers, there's a lot of legislation to keep track of, and nobody knows it all and nobody's an expert at all. This is just some of the examples that you can see that are there. For example, the Occupational Health and Safety Act. You'll see that's the green book. A lot of the book you see, they're very thick. Those are called consolidated versions, meaning it has a lot of legislation in it. But the way the Ontario works is they divide the province into 5 sectors: industrial, construction, healthcare, mining, and a thing called professional services. And for most of those, there's an individual regulation that is more specific. So typically, the Act, or the Occupational Health and Safety Act, is a general document with some specifics, so roles, responsibilities, duties, but there are some specific things in there as well. And then there are, depending on the nature of your business, so for example, you're a manufacturing facility, the specifics of the manufacturing facility are in Regulation 851 for industrial establishments. For hospitals and healthcare, it's Regulation 6793. Construction's 21391, mining's is 854. But then there's also regulations for farming, specific regulations for WHMIS, for designated substance, biological, chemical agents, definitions of critical injury. So you can see there's a lot there. So you don't have to know it all, but you need to know where to find it. And right now, online is a wonderful source. You can find them all online. Before, you used to have the hard copy. You can have virtual copies now, and then you can find and reference and all there. But again, if you're in manufacturing or services or even offices, then the Occupational Health and Safety Act and Regulation 851 for industrial establishments applies. So just quickly, WSPS, or Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, we're one of 4 health and safety associations. Our mandate covers industrial, services, and agricultural. Other health and safety associations like IHSA, Infrastructure Health and Safety, that cover power lines, that cover construction. Healthcare is covered by PSHA, Public Services Health and Safety. And then we have Health and Safety North. So there's, lots of resources out there to support employers. But our main mandate, and just because that's our mandate, that doesn't mean we don't sometimes work in other sectors, but we try to focus on manufacturing or industrial, services, and agriculture. So that's just an overview of a lot of the different options. Again, there's more. I think, not enough room on the screen to put them all. But then, as you can see within the Act, there's lots of sections that outline responsibilities and duties. So you can see there's quite a list. Pretty much everything is covered. I might even missed one or two because they keep adding to it. But it identifies what your responsibility is and what you're responsible to in health and safety. So constructor, if you're not sure, constructor usually happens on a construction project where there might be multiple trades, so plumbers, carpenters, electricians. So a constructor is responsible for overall safety. If you're an employer and you have a construction project, even in an industrial situation, which there's a definition of construction project, we're not going to get too deep into that. But typically, the ministry wants one party responsible for everything. It could be confusing if you have multiple parties. So the constructor is the one party that has overall responsibility. It could be the employer, or it could be, for example, a general contractor that the employer's assigned to the duties and has a contract in place for that. But you can see there's duties of employers, duties of supervisors, workers, owners, projects, again, construction related, suppliers, directors, and then ultimately there's the powers of the inspectors. So today's topic is about awareness and training. So when we look at, these are just some examples, again, of where you might find legislative references to training or awareness, right? So for example, if people don't know, if you look at 25(1)(c), the measures and procedures prescribed or carried out in the workplace, prescribed means written elsewhere. So it could be written in one of the other sources of legislation that we just reviewed. It could be written in the Industrial Establishments Regulation. So if it's written in the Industrial Establishments Regulation, then that means it applies in two ways. It applies to the industrial regs, and it also applies to the duties of the employer. And we'll get into how that impacts employers later on. But again, you can see there's lots of different ways where they're mentioning. The main one that's the distinction for training is 25(2)(a). And again, we're going to go into a lot more depth into that later on because that's pretty much the topic of what we're discussing here. But it says provide information, instruction, and supervision to a worker to protect the health and safety of the worker. So you see in 25(2)(d), it says acquaint a worker. So you can understand that that's probably a reference to awareness. But again, there's a distinction, and we're going to get into how you make that distinction yourself. Right? So moving on, our first poll of the question. So even though we have all those responsibilities that were outlined, again, sorry, if the poll doesn't work for you, you can just put it in the chat. But who is responsible for administering the day-to-day safety rules at work? And rules are policies, procedures, requirements, awareness, training, all those kind of things. Good, so we're getting a lot of answers. That's good to see. So far, we're doing well. Just give them another minute. Okay, so let's see what the answer is. Section 27 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So if you read it directly, so, the answer is supervisor. So generally speaking, the employer puts a program in place and the supervisor manages it day to day. So on the previous slide, we saw section 25(2)(j). That's a duty of the employer to have a written health and safety policy and to develop and implement a program to support that policy and review it annually. Well, here's how you support that policy is the supervisor is the one to ensure that works in the manner and with the protective devices, measures and procedures required by the Act and the regulations. So in other words, if there's requirements for safety shoes, then that'll be spelled out in Regulation 851, Section 79 through 84, 85. And so it'll be in there. So the supervisor has to make sure you wear them where there's a risk of injury to the foot. They also are the ones, again, has to wear the protective devices. So that's the supervisor's role. And they have to advise a worker of the existence of any potential or actual danger to the health and safety of the worker, which the supervisor is aware. Right? So, and then finally, where so prescribed, provide a worker with written instructions as to the measure, again, and procedures to be taken for the protection of the worker. So prescribed, again, means written elsewhere. So, and the last one's what's known as the General Duty Clause. The General Duty Clause is in two places in the Act. It's under the duties of the employer, Section 25(2)(h), and as you can see, Section 27(2)(c) for the supervisors. And essentially, he says you have to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of the worker. So if you're not sure, if there's a doubt between whether awareness is enough or training is enough, consider that clause. Consider what's reasonable in the circumstances. Is awareness enough to protect a worker from health and safety injury? And if yes, then you're okay. If not, then develop some training procedures, policies, safe work practices whatever you believe as the employer is necessary to support worker safety. So the one thing, I forgot to mention is that, our job is to provide guidance, information, consulting, sometimes in training, but ultimately every employer is responsible for determining what's an acceptable level of risk in their workplace. So even though we're here to support, we give information. Employers are the ones that determine what to do in their workplace. So that's kind of, the determining factor of who ultimately makes the decision. So at the end of this session, if you find that, again, you're doing fine and everything's good, great. If not, if you have questions, go to your supervisor, go to your director, go to your employer, and ask a few questions to find out whether there's something you can do a little bit better. That works best in the spirit of cooperation, when we're trying to work together again through the internal responsibility system. So how do you determine where the safety rules are and where do they come from? So again, a safety rule could be a policy, it could be a program, it could be a procedure, it could be a safe work practice. Some people call them standard operating procedures. Some people call it safe operating procedures, things like that. But safety rules come from specific sections of the regulation or the act or the hazards at work. So once more later on in this session, we're going to get into a little bit deeper about the distinction between hazard and risk. But there are multiple places in the act and the regulation where training is specifically required or awareness. And it says so in the legislation. So, how do you determine? Well, you have to find the legislation. Again, that could be a little bit of a challenge because there's so much of it, but it's there. And then ultimately, the one that really matters is hazards at work. Hazards are how people can get injured. And so we want to make sure that, everybody's protected. So that's where the safety rules come from. Again, there's corporate policies and procedures, finance things like expenses and reports, things like that, vacation time. Those aren't really related to safety. Those are more internal things, but they could be something that people need training on or awareness on as well. That's an internal mechanism and process for each employer. So here's just a few examples where it's specifically required under the legislation to do training. So you'll notice the first one, it actually says awareness training. So it's both of them. But this is the first one, it's called mandatory health and safety awareness training, safety in 4 steps for workers, safety in 5 steps for supervisors. Pretty much everyone, not pretty much, everyone in Ontario subject to the Occupational Health and Safety Act is required to complete this training or an internal training that meets the criteria that's set out in this regulation here, 21397. So an equivalency is what's called. So again, it's really about the rights of a worker. So just in case you forgot, workers typically have 3 rights and then 1 conditional right. The rights of the worker are the right to know about the hazards in their job and in the workplace. And they have the right to refuse unsafe work, which is covered off in Section 43 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And you have the right to participate in health and safety, which again is the internal responsibility system, Section 8, health and safety representatives, and Section 9, joint health and safety committees. So that's mandatory training for everyone in Ontario. And so you'll see a lot of times supervisors will do one and workers will do the other, but technically a supervisor is a worker as well. So a supervisor should do both of them. So that's available on the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training Skills Development's website. There'll be a link at the end. I did forget to mention off the top that unfortunately the PowerPoint won't be available, but you'll get follow-up thank you email with the resource links and information there. And as well, this is being recorded. So after a little bit of time to make me look a little bit prettier, because that's quite a task, it'll be available on the website. So it'll take a little time for that, but you'll have this recording available. So then you'll have access to it. So I forgot to mention that. Sorry about that. So Joint Health and Safety Committee training. So you have more than 20 workers under Section 9, subsection 12. At least 2 workers need to be certified. So they have to take mandatory Joint Health and Safety Committee certification training, which is 2 parts. Part 1 is more around the act and knowledge around health and safety. and part 2 is more hazard specific. And Joint Health and Safety Committee members have to take this training within 12 months. So they complete part 1, and then within 12 months has to complete part 2 to be fully certified. So there's no, and then every 3 years, they have to take a 1-day refresher training. Other mandatory training requirements are, again, personal protective equipment, or PPE. So you can see under Section 9, it says a worker required to wear or use any protective clothing, equipment, or devices shall be instructed and trained in its care and use before wearing or using the protective clothing, equipment, or device. A lot of times we'll have clients ask us and say, well, the company has a policy to wear safety shoes, but they don't want to. So what do we do? Well, as you can see here, it's a requirement. If the company has a requirement to wear safety shoes, then people have to wear safety shoes. And again, it's the supervisor's responsibility to enforce that. Now, you want to try to work with people. You want to try to find out why they wouldn't be wearing safety shoes. Might not be a good example, because generally speaking, people wear their safety shoes when they need to. But same thing with protective, safety glasses. A lot of times people will forget to put them on top of their head, so they need a gentle reminder. But if it's a requirement, it's a requirement, and you have to wear it. Right? So other areas where there's mandatory training requirements is workplace violence and harassment. And this is one of the topics that we're going to go into in more depth later on, because there is a little bit of confusion, the distinction between awareness and training in there. But you can see I've referenced the legislation, specifically under 32.0.5 and 32.0.8. It says that you have to train on the contents of your policy and your program. So again, we'll go into that a little bit more depth. Working at heights, that's also a requirement. So if you're working over 3 meters, you have to wear a harness and fall protection. It's written in the regulations, Section 85 for industrial, but it's also more in depth in the construction. So again, we're not really getting into construction. But one thing to note about working at heights is, even though the limit says, or the minimum is, or the legislation says 3 meters, there have been situations where people have been less than 3 meters and they've fallen, have been seriously injured, and there were no protections in place, and the employer still faced prosecution. So again, this is where you look at the general duty clause. Again, the legislation is the minimum. It might say at 3 meters, but if you're at 2 meters, which is still, roughly 6 feet, and you fall, there can be serious implications, serious injuries. So as an organization, you want to look into that and find out, what is your policy, what is your program? And first of all, do you have anybody that works at height? And if you do, you can reference the legislation and then look at reasonable precautions in the circumstances. If they're over or under 3 meters, can they still fall? Is it still a risk to workers? And what should we do about it? And again, another mandatory training. So if you're working with a hazardous product where air quality assessment has been completed, or not even completed, but there's a risk of air quality issues to the worker, and the organization or the legislation demands the use of a respirator, whether it be an N95 or the half-face mask with the filters, then it's a requirement and you have to wear it. So if it's a requirement, you have to wear it, then you have to train people on the proper use, handling, storage, and care, and then the proper fit example, which is a fit testing process that workers that have to wear respirators must go through as a requirement. So, any questions so far on that? Okay, so we'll move beyond the legislation and we'll start getting into a little bit of the distinction between awareness and training. And whether it matters or whether it makes a difference. So we're going to move to our second poll. And the poll is, so if you're not sure or you didn't know, a lot of employers use an LMS system, which is a learning management system, which is used to track and store legislation, sort of training and programs, policies, and procedures. But if you use an LMS system, is that enough to meet all the requirements in health and safety? Okay, we got some good responses coming in. So good to see you. I'll give it one more minute. Okay, so let's close that poll and let's review this for a second. So we have quite a few responses. The answer is C, maybe. It depends. So it depends again on the nature of the topic that you're using your management system from. If you're using an awareness system and so for example, an awareness topic, and there is no safety repercussions to a worker, there's no circumstances where a worker can get hurt, then that's fine. The idea of sign-off is not that relevant. So for example, you do training for a bunch of people in a classroom and there's 10 people and 2 people refuse to sign. It doesn't really matter. You'll make a note saying the employee refused to sign, but we completed it. Here's our record. Here's how it's done. Again, if you're using the LMS system for tracking, then you're going to need that to be acknowledged as an internal process. But from the Ministry of Labor perspective, if you know you've done the training and you have it there and somebody just refused to sign off, then it's not really going to make a difference one way or the other. Obviously, it's easier and better if people sign off to the training, especially for tracking, especially for documentation for yourself. But depends on the nature of the topic and the requirement and how you've designed this and what you're going to do. And again, that's the purpose of this, is to show that distinction between awareness and training, and where doing an LMS system record keeping process alone is not enough. So we're going to quickly go into a definition of awareness and training. So this comes right off the internet, obviously. It's not supposed to be complicated, but awareness is essentially the first step, is making people notice that we have something, whether it's a policy or procedure or whatever it is. Whereas training is actually giving people the specific skill set and the instructions to complete an activity, a task, or work on a machine, or do something where there's a potential for injury or a specific requirement in the legislation. So again, awareness is just a start for most things. We are going to get into how you make this distinction between awareness and training, what's the best way to do it. Obviously, if it's in the legislation, then you have to follow the legislation, even if it's awareness. And we're going to go into an example of that. And if you're not sure, you can always reach out to WSPS, and we have on our website a consultant page, and you can ask questions. It's our job to supply that information, help you find this legislation and the relevance, and make these determinations for yourself. But that's pretty much the way the definition is, and the distinction is. Awareness is just your first level overview, whereas training is teaching you how to do it. So again, there's lots of different sources that are used by employers. E-learning options, like we just discussed, virtual training sessions, orientation is a big one. So a lot of employers do orientation. So that orientation would be the first look at something. So you're typically doing it when you're new, or you're starting a new position within the same company. And a lot of times orientation could be a little overwhelming. There could be a lot of topics, a lot of information to go through, and this is standard for a lot of organizations. But if there are things, again, that people need further information around, then the orientation is not going to be enough. You're going to want to follow it up. And that could be in the way you manage your system and your health and safety at work, right? So again, LMS systems, which are used generally for tracking and storage. There's also third-party, trainings that you can purchase, that you can do. So if that's awareness, that's fine. If it's specific to a task or an activity in your business, then that training, if you want to call it, needs to be augmented with the specific measures and procedures at your workplace. So again, we're talking about things like violence, harassment, WHMIS, Lockout, Tagout, what's also known as hazardous energy, job descriptions, HR policies, procedures. Those are some specific examples of all the way to do it. Obviously, some of the training could be one-on-one as well with your supervisor, or in groups on the shop floor, depending on what you're doing. And here's an example of some of those topics. Again, we talked about orientation. health and safety reps and joint health and safety committee. So there is no specific requirement for training for a health and safety representative. So if you have between 6 and 19 workers in your business, you need a health and safety rep. Unlike joint health and safety committees, there's no certification requirement. But again, if you go to WSPS and you Google health and safety representative, there's lots of free resources to support health and safety reps on how to do meet the requirements under Section 8 of the Act. There's sample checklists, there's guidance documents, there's even an 8-hour training course that they can take that's voluntary that you want to do if you want to give them additional information. So health and safety representatives, unlike joint health and safety committees, don't have specific training requirements, but they do play an important role in an organization. WHMIS, we already discussed, Ministry of Labor awareness training, we talked. Hazardous energy control is a lockout tagout. We're going to go more into depth into that a little later. Pedestrian safety and forklifts and transportation. So again, that might be identified in Regulation 851, but pedestrian safety is a high-risk hazard. So if you have a manufacturing facility and you have lots of forklifts moving around and you have transportation trucks shipping and receiving coming in, it's pretty high risk. There's lots of situations where unfortunately people have been struck and fatally injured, through pedestrian safety issues. So it might not be specifically outlined where you need to do training, but that's something you're going to look at. Forklifts, obviously there is training for that, but you need to be aware of the risks, and we're going to go into that as a violence and harassment as well. We talked about working nights, we talked about, and then, again, depending on the circumstances in your business, how you work, what you work with, whether there's industrial hygiene issues. So if you're a manufacturer that makes kitchen countertops out of marble, the marble, when you're cutting that marble, leaves off dust, which is silica. So then you're required to do an air quality exposure for silica, measuring the exposure levels. Silica is a designated substance, so you have to do a designated substance assessment. And then if you use the results of your assessment to require, for example, respirators, then you need to do training again on the respirators, the proper testing. So those are just some topics. Obviously, there's a lot. If some of you are the ones responsible for administering your internal systems, you know there's lots to keep track of. So there's lots here. So metaphorically, the way to look at this is awareness is the menu and training is the recipe. So, when you go to a restaurant, you look at the menu and you can see everything that's there. So you can see all the options, all the choices, you're aware of the selections, and then you choose what you want. And then the training is how do somebody make that, say you ordered some tiramisu. Well, how do they make it? What are the step-by-step instructions? Not just for making the dessert, but also for how to do it safely. So the difference between awareness and training is awareness is giving you an idea that something is there, whereas training is the step-by-step instructions to do it safely. So this is a big way, a big distinction, and it's really important. And again, you want to make sure that you're aware of the differences and the distinctions and how you apply them in your business. Any questions on that? That clear it up a little bit for anybody looking at it that way? Okay, we'll move forward. So when is awareness enough? So again, a lot of organizations use internal management systems to do the training, to do awareness. So awareness is enough when what you need to do is to be informed that something exists. That something could be a policy, it could be a process, it could be something that goes on in your business. Some example includes corporate policies and procedures. But in health and safety, it could be also, depending on the nature of your business and the complexity, you might have forklifts. So you have forklifts, then you might not need to be trained on forklifts, but you need to be aware that forklifts are in use in the plant and where are they generally, and is there a walkway that you need to stay in? Are there mirrors at corners and intersections? Things like that. So you don't need to know how to operate a forklift, but you need to know that you have forklifts in the business and pedestrian safety is a risk. Also, something like working at heights. Again, we talked about it a little bit. all you need to know is that we do have working at heights. If you don't work at height as part of your job, then you don't need training on that. But it's helpful to be aware that the organization has working heights throughout the facility or in some of the tasks and the jobs that we do. So if you don't need to do the work where there's a risk, then you don't need training. You just need to be made aware. You can overlap the two. Again, pedestrian safety is a good example. You might need to know, where the safe areas are when you're walking through a warehouse, particularly when you get close to the storage area or shipping and receiving, what you need to be aware of to stay safe to avoid collisions, right? So there's an overlap there. So you can call that training if you want, pedestrian safety training on, your safety if working in the warehouse is not your typical job. So say, for example, your job is in the office and you're in procurement and you need to go back to the warehouse to drop off, a purchase order or something like that. Then as you're navigating through the warehouse, you need to know where to stay to keep yourself safe. Typically, a lot of places will have lines on the warehouse to help you with that. So that's where awareness is enough, where you don't need to actually apply anything yourself. So you just need to be informed that something exists, right? So if there is a potential for injury or direct legislative requirement, then training is required. So you can do the awareness, and this is where you can look at the general duty clause again, which is taking reasonable precautions. What's reasonable in your business? What's reasonable with the activities, the things that people do that could cause an injury? If there's an injury, then you need training. If there's potential for an injury, then there's training that's required. If there's no potential for an injury, for example, an HR policy, you can't get hurt from that. So you need awareness, you need to be aware, and then you need to be able to find that policy in your internal system. But there's no training specifically required unless you need to apply for, again, expenses, but that's not training. You can figure that one out. So where there's a risk to injury, you need to do training, right? So if there are consequences, to the actions that people are doing, to the work they're doing, if there are hazards, if there are, things like hygiene, like noise, like industrial air quality issues, if even something as simple as using a ladder, if there's a consequence to an individual and that individual needs to practice this or do this activities as part of their job, or may be exposed to it, like, for example, noise. If it's noisy in a part of the warehouse and you need to go back there, you need to be aware of that. You might need to put on, ear protection in the interim. So wherever there's a consequence, you need training. That's pretty much what it comes down to. Because again, if we go back to the beginning, the purpose of health and safety is to ensure nobody gets injured at work. We don't want people injured. That's what it's all about. So this distinction, err on the side of providing training if there's a potential for an injury. So going back to this definition, section 25(2)(a), the employer shall provide information, instructions, and see what's in the definition. It says to protect the health and safety of the worker. So that's where you need to make your distinction between awareness and training. So you need to ask if you're not sure, or move it forward to your committee, your health and safety rep, to your supervisor. In our organization, are there any situations, activities, hazards that I need to be aware of that are a source of danger for me in the job that I'm doing or the people under my authority, right? So generally speaking, the easiest way to look at it is this acronym PEMEP, which stands for, you want to look for, people, equipment, materials, environment, and process that work in our environment, in our place of business. So you want to look at those as a general. How are the people impacted? What kind of equipment do we use? Are the materials that we use? The environment, again, things like air quality, noise, and the process. Do we have conveyors? Do we have a production line that comes down? So when you're looking at all these things here, is there a risk of injury to the worker? Do we need to protect the health and safety of the worker? And if the answer is yes, then you need to do training. So just we're going to move forward to the next slide. And this one is you can just put the answer in the meeting chat. And where there's a risk of injury in the work that you do you know the specific steps required to do your work safely? So in other words, if you have something where there's a potential risk of injury for you, do you know clearly? And if I was to ask you on the spot, do you have the knowledge and do you know the steps and the requirements, PPE, for example, to do that safely? Yes is a great answer. Good. And again, if you're not sure, go to your supervisor. Good. So we got some great answers. A lot of people seem to be on top of it. That's wonderful. That means things are working well. One way the Ministry of Labor will look at it is they will look at a transfer of knowledge. So a lot of programs, even though they might be in writing, might not necessarily be required to be in writing. So generally speaking, the way an inspector will manage that is they'll walk into a supervisor and they'll say, tell me about a hazard in your department. And they'll say, oh, well, we cut, we use a saw and we do some cutting. And so, okay, well, tell me what the worker needs to do to protect themselves. Well, they have to make sure the guard is on the saw and it's working. They have to make sure they wear their safety glasses. And then they'll go to a worker. So give me a worker in your department. You ask the worker, so I understand you work with a saw. What are some organizational requirements that you need to know to operate that saw safely? And they'll ask those questions and they get the answer from the worker. And if a worker answers very closely to the supervisor, then that's a transfer of knowledge. Then that means the training has been provided and the worker understands and applies it. So that's kind of generally speaking where an inspector will, check for a knowledge transfer for a worker, or again, where there's a risk of injury. So we're going to go into depth into a little bit more of two specific situations or three specific situations, so we can expand on all that. But I'm glad to see I didn't see any no's, so that's wonderful news. So how do you determine what kind of training you're going to need to do, whether awareness is enough or not? So a hazard is how somebody can get hurt, right? While the risk is what's the likelihood or the severity of that harm or the probability of it happening, right? So a lot of people have a hard time distinguishing the difference between a hazard and a risk. The way I remember it is crossing the ocean is a hazard. Crossing the ocean in a rowboat is a significantly higher risk than in an ocean liner. But even though you're using an ocean liner, I think we all understand that that doesn't mean you have zero risk, right? It greatly reduces the risk, but there's still a risk there. So the hazard is crossing the ocean. How you cross it impacts the level of risk to workers. So then again, you want to look at the hazard, see how bad it could be, how badly somebody can get injured. So that'll help you identify the risk level, and then you develop your policies, your procedures, your SOPs, etc. on that, and then train people on it. So if you haven't done a hazard assessment, it's pretty much the foundational way to begin. It helps you identify all of the hazards in your workplace, helps you rank them based on the level of risk, and then allows you to allocate your resources where they matter. So if you haven't done a hazard assessment, this is a free tool. There's a video. It's on our website again. You could do it. You don't have to be an expert at it. There's no specific way to do it. There's multiple different ways to do hazard assessments. But if you're unsure, you need some clarity, you can do a hazard assessment. There's lots of different ways. Again, like I said, you can do it department by department. You can do it by tasks and activities, by job hazard analysis, those are called. But this is an explicit way of understanding what your hazards and your risks are, so that you can make a determination whether you need to do awareness or training on it, right? So what really comes down to employers, I don't think it's a secret now that everybody is taxed. All of the tariff conversation creates an volatile environment. You know, a lot of us are doing 3 jobs. That's just the nature of the workplace now. But identifying your hazards and developing the risk levels helps you allocate your resources and spend your time and energy on the highest risk that you have. So one more time, going back to the purpose of health and safety, yes, there's legislation, there's information, all that kind of stuff. But in the end, the goal is to make sure nobody gets injured. So you want to be spending your time on those activities that or tasks that you're doing that have the highest risk. So what do? So you identify, you do your hazard assessment, and even if it's already been done, you look at it, and then you identify your top priorities. And you want to be spending your time and your energy on those activities, those hazards where somebody can get most seriously injured. So one of the things that I get questions about a lot is how often do we have to do training? Well, at the very least, you have to review it annually. Most situations don't call for specific trainings in terms of how frequently, but you have to review it at least annually. So in that case, again, if we go back to the earlier example of transfer of knowledge, if you go back to that worker that's working using the saw and you want to quickly, as the supervisor, just ask them, hey, just as a reminder, what do you need to know to do this work safely? I need to make sure the guard is on it and make sure, that I got my safety glasses on and things like that. So you can check to see if the knowledge is still there. If there's an incident or if a gap has been identified and you make changes or you make adjustments and you change a policy, you change a procedure, then when you make that change, then you need to do that training. So as a rule of thumb, it needs to be reviewed annually. For example, 25.2J, again, your health and safety program needs to be reviewed at least annually, and that's the overarching theme. But if there's a change, if there's an incident and you had to adjust or a change in your policy, then you need to train on that as well. But again, the goal is to focus on your top priorities. By regularly, I mean, if it's a high risk, speak to people more often about it. Remind them more often. It's not necessarily about remembering every single step, but it's about interrupting instinct. So you have a good worker and there's an issue that happens, and say there's a jam in the production line. And a good worker wants to get the work done, their first instinct might be to reach in, right? So what you want to do is interrupt that instinct and say, oh, there's something I'm supposed to do here. Right, and then recall the steps, because we're busy. You got a lot on your mind. Sometimes there's pressure, there's production demands, all those kind of things. So the reason why you do it more often for the higher risk is, you're trying to interrupt that instinct and then create a reference for people to look so they can do safely. All too often in my line of work and what we do, it's just a moment, and you can't get that moment back. So especially when there's high risks, you want to interrupt that moment and make sure people understand that there's something they're supposed to be doing here to protect themselves for safety. And this is a good rule of thumb to manage your resources, right? So most businesses have between 4 and 12 high risks. They could be repeated multiple times in the business. But again, depending on the complexity of the business, but you want to keep those in higher rotation. So how often are you going to do training? For high-risk activities, even though it says you only have to review it annually, you want to do it more often and more frequently, because that's where it makes a difference, and that's where there are consequences. Any questions about a hazard assessment or prioritizing? Okay, so let's get into a couple of examples then. These are some of the more common examples that I hear when I get conversations with employers. We do violence and harassment awareness. Is that enough? We do WHMIS. We have hazardous energy control. Not all businesses have this, Lockout, Tagout, but it's a perfect example that shows the distinction between awareness and training, and that's kind of why I wanted to cover that topic here. So we're going to look at those 3 examples. So the first one is violence and harassment. Workplace violence and harassment is covered under section 32.0.1 to 32.0.8 in the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And in there's multiple requirements, lots of information that is required to be followed by an employer. So moving on to the next chat question. Do you know if your business has completed a workplace violence risk assessment? Great. We have a lot of great yes answers again. Doing one right now. There you go. Good for you. Right? And the reason why this question comes up is that it's important. Good. A lot of people on the way. Upon orientation. So I'm not sure about the answer for that, but a risk assessment for violence is a specific activity that you need to complete at least once and then review it annually and see if there's any changes. So when you're talking about a risk assessment, that organization needs to complete that to identify all of the risks for violence that a workplace or a worker might face. So here's where it says in the legislation, specifically required. Again, this is a one-time thing, but to review annually. If there's any changes in circumstances in your business, then you need to adapt it like we mentioned earlier. But it says an employer shall assess the risk of workplace violence that may arise in the nature of the workplace, the type of work, or the conditions of the work. The hard part is there no formalized required template you have to use. There's lots of resources out there. You can do it your own way. There's the Occupational Health and Safety Council of Ontario that has a guide that you can use. It's pretty lengthy. I think it's 86 pages, but it's just repeating the same review over and over. We use that OSCO tool, a modified version of the OSCO tool. The way we do it is we look at the general physical environment, routes of entry. Then we look at 9 risk factors. Things like working alone or in small numbers. So when you're doing your violence risk assessment, when you're working alone, it's not just the activities. Consider, the start of the day, the end of the day. Some people work late. There might be 1 or 2 of them leaving the parking lot late at night, or the first ones to arrive to get there. So it's a risk. You identify the risk, you make a determination whether it's high, medium, or low, and then you develop measures and procedures according to that risk. There's also risk factors like direct contact with clients. So if you invite clients into your workplace or you go visit them at their workplace, what's the risk level again? There's handling cash. There's transporting goods or people. So there's 9 risk factors you use, and you can decide how they apply and do a subjective evaluation of what the risk level is internally for your business. Once you do that, you have to use those results to develop measures and procedures for the safety of the workers. So again, here's the program requirements. So you see in section 32.0.2a, include measures and procedures to control the risks identified in the assessment required under subsection 32.0.3, right? There's also, and here's why violence and harassment is not enough, because it says you have to include measures, procedures to report incidents of violence and harassment, how to summon immediate assistance. Those are specific to your business. So a lot of awareness sessions that you might do online, we have some as well. They're awareness on violence and harassment. They tell you what's required. They don't do the specific, because imagine online, you can't do it individually for every business. Again, it has to be specific to the risks in your business, and how to report and who to report to is different for every business. So this is the things that people need to be actually trained on, and that's why awareness for violence harassment itself is not enough. It's a good start. You'll go over the definitions of violence, the definition of harassment, the requirements for the employer, but then you need to develop, you as the employer, your own program. And then you need to train against your program. Same thing with harassment, right? So you have to include measures and procedures. So with harassment, there's a couple additional steps. Who do you report to for harassment? Let's say, for an example, it's your supervisor. Well, what if your supervisor is the one that you believe is harassing you? You need to know who to go to next. Sometimes the answer is just HR. Sometimes it's your director, sometimes it's a specific person, but individually you need to know this. And in an awareness session that you do online or that you purchase from a third party, it won't tell you specifically what to do about this. And this is why awareness for violence harassment is not satisfactory. It does not meet all the requirements. You still need, you can do both. You can do the awareness session online, but then you need to follow up with the specific contents and requirements of your program. All right. Here's the relevant legislation. It says employer shall provide a worker with information and instruction as appropriate for the worker on the contents of the policy and program with respect to workplace violence. And again, prescribed means written anywhere else. All right. So the contents and policy of the policy and program. So that's your policy and program. And again, that's why awareness itself is not enough. So you need to look at 32.0.1 through 32.0.8. You need to do a violence risk assessment. Then you need to develop your program, and you need to be able to teach people the measures and procedures on your program for each one of these risk factors that you have and what your internal process is. So one thing, an additional note about harassment and violence when you need to do an investigation, a couple things actually. You need to maintain privacy as much as possible. But if there are two parties involved, you have the right to interview both to gather some intelligence to figure out what happened to do your report. But the Occupational Health and Safety Act doesn't give a length of time you have to complete your report and your investigation. But consider for a second a real issue of harassment, and somebody's come to you, you're the HR manager or you're the supervisor, and they're reporting a case of harassment. That person is dealing with a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of stress going on. And if they don't know how long it's going to take to complete the investigation, their anxiety just keeps going up. Whereas if you tell them, we'll do our investigation and give you the report within 14 days or 30 days, then they can just tell themselves, I just got to make it to 40 days or 30 days, and then this will be, the next step of the process will be hopefully resolved. So consider your program, consider a timeline. Again, it's not specifically required, but when it comes to supporting people that are actually dealing with real issues of harassment in the workplace, then a timeline really helps them and helps them remain productive in the workplace, helps their anxiety levels, things like that. So any questions on violence and harassment? Okay, good. Moving on. We'll pick another topic that's very popular, WHMIS. So WHMIS is covered under Ontario Regulation 860 for WHMIS, Workplace Hazard Material Information Systems. So we got another poll for you to do. Every worker in Ontario needs to complete WHMIS. True, false, or maybe? Okay, good. You've seen a lot of good answers there. So maybe that'll shock a few people, but the answer is, the answer is maybe. Why? Because under Regulation 860 for WHMIS, Section 6 and 7 covers off worker education. And this is the specific definition. An employer shall ensure that a worker who works with or may be exposed in the course of his or her work to a hazardous product received from a supplier is informed about all the hazard information. So if you're an office environment, so again, I get this call a lot, you might have cleaning chemicals. So you have a staff that comes in and cleans the office, and let's say those Windex, et cetera, are locked in a storage. Well, how do you have exposure, or do you work with those chemicals? Right? The answer is probably no. If it's not, then you don't need to do WHMIS training. So, but if the answer is yes, say the chemicals are out and you have access to them or you've been exposed to them. Again, it's a little tricky because it says received from a supplier. Well, you can buy some pretty hazardous products from a Home Depot or a Costco or all these kind of things. Printer ink replacement is not one. You shouldn't be exposed to it. It shouldn't be a high hazard. But again, going back to every employer is responsible for determining what's an acceptable level of risk. If, as an organization, you determine the printer ink is a high enough risk, then you can do WHMIS training, right? So the first step is determining whether you meet this definition. If you do meet the definition, what kind of training do you need to do? Well, you need to do the training according to Section 7 in WHMIS. And now there's more to it than this, but these are the three things. The number one thing is you need to know about the specific information around the chemical that you're using, the product that you're using. And again, this is why awareness training, online training for WHMIS is not enough. The online training will tell you about the labels, tell you about the symbols, tell you about SDS sheets, what's all the contents on SDS sheet. But then the worker that works with or is exposed to a chemical needs training on the chemicals, each chemical that you use. So for example, what kind of PPE do they need? Do they need safety glasses? Do they need an apron? Do they need a respirator? Do they need a shield instead of safety glasses because the product can splash? They need training on that. Again, if they need a respirator, then they need additional training on how to handle, store, and use a respirator and fit testing. What's the first aid requirements? What happens if you get the product, the chemical on you or accidentally ingested? What are the steps people need to know, specifically for each chemical? Some chemicals are harsh, and if you ingest it, it burns on the way down. You don't want to regurgitate because it'll burn on the way back up. So these are the specifics that people need to know. So when you do online training, awareness training for WHMIS, that's why it's not enough. So if you meet the definition, then you need to train on the SDS sheets. And one way to figure that out is to use your Joint Health and Safety Committee. Again, this is only one way. Ultimately, it's the employer's determination, but your committee is there to support you and to help you, right? And it is their function, it is their power to review or identify a source of danger, and B, make recommendations to the constructor or the employer for the improvement. So if, for example, there's uncertainty, take a look at the definition under Section 6, see if there's an SDS sheet that applies, and then make a recommendation whether, who, and how many people need to do WHMIS training, and then how you're going to do it. So again, if you're in an office environment and you're not really using chemicals, you have a janitorial company that comes in at night, they do all the cleaning, everything is locked and stored, you don't have access to it, then you can do the e-learning training as awareness, and that's enough. However, for those people that actually work with the chemicals, they need specific training on the SDS sheets. So that's the distinction. And not everybody needs training on those SDS sheets, just the people that are using the product. Or if you're in an area and you're exposed to it as well. Right? So again, if there's a hygiene issue where the chemical you're using wafts in the air and you could be exposed to it and you're working in that area, then you need requirements based on the SDS sheet as well. Another area that's a concern that we get questions all about is an eye wash station. So the SDS sheet will state whether an eye wash station is required based on the risk of injury to the eye. An eye wash station needs to, most of them say 15 minutes of continuous flow. So if you have those bottles are meant to be a temporary measure to get you to the eye wash station. So if you do use chemicals that requires 15 minutes of continuous flow, then you need actually a specific eye wash station and not just the bottles. So your committee can review the definitions, can review the process, the chemicals, the products you use, and then make a recommendation to the employer for the training. So that's just one way of helping you identify. So now we're going to talk about Lockout Tagout, which is also known as hazardous energy controls. It's covered under Regulation 851 for industrial establishments, Section 75 and 76. And again, I selected this one, even though it's not always common. But if you have machines or you do maintenance and it has energy sources, even if it's electrical, it needs to be locked out and tagged out before you use it. So here's the relevant legislation to give you a guidance. It's specifically there, again, under Regulation 851. But the biggest distinction is awareness versus authorized training. So here's an example, affected versus authorized. So if you don't do any maintenance and you don't do any work on the machines, if you are operating a manufacturer in a plant and you are operating machines and the machine breaks down and you need to do training, there are only certain people in the business that are authorized to do that repair, to do lockout tagout. And that's the training part. Those people that are authorized, typically it's your maintenance team, could be a supervisor, but they go through extensive training on all the different energy sources, the lockout points, how to do it. Typically, there's placards that are done. It's not a legal requirement, but it's there to help you, support you. Everybody else needs to know you have a lockout tagout program. So we joke around with our machine safety specialists and we say, you know, if you're affected, in other words, you don't do lockout tagout, you don't do maintenance, then every second slide should be don't touch, call your supervisor. Because after 30 days later, that's what you need to remember. You need to remember that this is awareness for me. I'm not allowed to do this. I can't do it, so I don't touch. If something goes wrong, I stop, I step away, and I'll call my supervisor. The supervisor, if they're not authorized, will get an authorized person. They'll come in and do it. So this is a very clear distinction. A lot of businesses, again, will have lockout tagout, and there might be, say, for example, a plant with 70 people. There might be 4 people that are authorized, 5 people, depending on the nature of the business. So this is a very clear example, a very distinct example. And when we do lockout tagout programs, we do both types of training. So obviously the authorized worker is a lot more in-depth. The affected worker is about a 45-minute awareness session, letting you know what our program is, what we have, what we do. And again, don't touch, call your supervisor. So how does all of this matter? Well, this matters is if something happens, if something goes wrong, or there's Ministry of Labor intervention. So that's, you know, the distinction between, again, going back to the general duty clause, if you're not sure what's reasonable in the circumstances. But you can see here, this is an excerpt from a Supreme Court of Canada case. It says a court must determine whether the accused has proven on a balance of probabilities that it should avoid liability because it exercised due diligence. Due diligence in health and safety is widely understood as taking every precaution reasonable in the circumstances. So I'm going to give a specific example of what that means. A lot of times you hear people say document, 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 but what does reasonable in the circumstances mean? So a specific section of Regulation 851 is machine safety. So anything that has a moving part says a machine shall be shielded or guarded so the product, material being processed or waste stock will not endanger the safety of the worker. So that's Regulation 851, Section 26. But what does in the circumstances mean? So let's say you have a guard on, but you're doing maintenance, or there's a jam, or something's happened, there's a demand for production and the guard slows things down. Is there a situation where a worker might disable that guard? And if yes, what are, in the circumstances, safety measures you're going to put in place? So for example, if it's maintenance, then your safety measures in place are lockout tagout. You're locking everything out, powering it off, putting the lock on with your tag. All right. So when you're looking at your organization, it's not enough to just say we have a guard. In the circumstances means what would happen to a worker. Another one might be ladder safety. So somebody's using a ladder and they're getting material down from a rack and they have to reach across. Right. So if you're reaching across, is in the circumstances of doing that job, is that a possibility? If it is a possibility, then a step ladder or the straight ladders won't work. You might want to consider those blue ladders that has a platform because it's natural instincts to reach a boss. I've just got to get this one more item and move it down. So in the circumstances, what would happen and what do you need to do about it? Do you need to create a safe work practice and do you need to train people on it? So, and then obviously you're going to document and keep your record. Again, a lot of things don't have to be in writing, but it's a lot easier to avoid liability and prosecution if you have documentation that demonstrates the steps you took. So that's an example of what due diligence means and how it's applied in the circumstances. You have to look at the legislation and the circumstances. So again, going back to 25.2a, information, instruction, and supervision. Information is generally the documents, typically in the classroom or online or through your LMS system. Instruction is teaching somebody how to do the job safely. What are the steps? What are the things they need to be aware of? That's usually done in the location, on the shop floor, or where the activity is being completed. And then supervision is ensuring, especially if it's new, that you're watching them, making sure that they've got it right, making sure they're applying the knowledge you just provided. And then once you're satisfied with that, on occasion, you have to check in and supervise to make sure the worker is doing the job. So this is due diligence as well: information, instruction, and supervision. As you can see with awareness training, you're not likely going to get the last two. You're going to get the first one. You're going to get documentations through maybe it's an e-learning, a virtual platform, or documentations you have. But again, if there's a risk of injury to the worker, you have to protect the health and safety of your worker. The requirement is to provide information, instruction, and supervision. So now we have a couple of examples to highlight that. I guess I should ask, is there any questions on that? Because that's the hard one. Where training is required, you have to do all three. If you don't do all three, you don't meet the definition of due diligence. And a worker could potentially be at risk. So here's an example, and I apologize. I meant to provide a bit of a trigger warning up front. I'm going to go over a couple of examples where there were some injuries and things like that. And not everybody, can listen to that or deal with that well. So you can turn your sound off or your camera off for now if you want. This will be a few slides. It's not going to be too much detail, but here I just wanted to provide some specific examples where all of this applies. So in this case, a worker was killed while disassembling a vacuum valve during a routine cleaning and maintenance. The company was in the business of repairing vacuum valves used in industrial applications. The procedure for disassembling required an internal spring by inserting a threaded rod through a hole in the valve cap. That's not the way the manufacturer suggested it. The manufacturer recommended a press to compress the valve to protect the person doing the task. On the day of the incident, the worker was working alone in the shop when he proceeded to disassemble the vacuum, and at some point in the disassembly, the threaded rod released and fatally struck the worker in the head. The worker assigned the task had only worked on the valve once before this, on one valve before that, and had been new with the company, only been there 6 months. So what was the outcome to that situation? Well, the shop coordinator or supervisor failed to take the reasonable precautions and was fined $5,000. The company failed to provide information, instruction, supervision to a worker to protect the safety of the worker and was fined $125,000. There's also a 25% victim surcharge that is applied, but you can see they were convicted under 25(2)A and 27(2)C. And again, 27(2)C is the reasonable precautions clause for the supervisors. So you can see where there's a risk of injury to a worker, where there's a safety factor involved, to protect a worker, you need to provide information, instruction, supervision. So another one, here's a situation where, unfortunately, again, a worker, there was a fatality, but in this particular case, the company was charged and then appealed, and through the appeal, the judge determined that the company had met the requirements of providing information, instruction, and supervision. So when you do it right, obviously, hopefully the goal is to make sure people are protected and don't get hurt. But if you do it right, then the repercussions are minimal to you as a business. So in this case, the judge overturned the finding because there was ample evidence through extensive employee training, including supervision, that the incident didn't happen because of the knowledge and transfer. So that's a case where if you do it right, you're exonerated. And unfortunately, in that case, somebody got seriously injured. Another one here is an incident of violence or harassment where a staff member was physically assaulted by a youth at a child and family services workplace facility. The youth worker had recently started an employment contract at the detention and custody unit for boys. As the worker was directing a youth to return to his room for the night, the youth became agitated, entered the office, and repeatedly struck the worker. A co-worker was also in the area, and they were physically injured, psychologically and physically as well. So this could go multiple different ways, but in this particular case, the company was fined for for failure to provide information, instruction, and supervision. Fine was $125,000. You can see they were convicted under section 25(2)A. But the way convictions goes is there are multiple counts. It might have been 25(2)A, it could have been 25(2)H, could have been 27(2)C, could have been 32.0.5 for violence. So there's multiple counts that occur, and that's what happens. And the ministry and the employer select the one that they get convicted on. And the last one, a worker is fined $1,500 for not using fall protection. So in this particular case, a Ministry of Labor inspector happened to notice a worker drop from a hoist tower onto another nearby roof. The inspector noticed it, saw that the worker was wearing the safety harness, but the lanyard was not connected. So again, the employer had done what they needed to do. They trained the worker, provided all the protective equipment, did everything they'd done, but unfortunately the worker failed to follow the procedures and the worker was fined. So again, the goal is to prevent injuries, but if you do your job and you do it right, some of these cases are recent, some of them are old. You can look on court bulletins, you can look on the Ontario Gazette, Occupational Health and Safety magazine has cold case history. Lots of law firms will give examples on their website as well. So I'm not sure exactly which dates on all of them are, but some of them are recent, some are old. The fines have increased over the last couple of years as well. So, but again, the goal is not the fines, the goal is to protect people. So how can we help you? So that's the end of the presentation, just a couple of more cleanup points. If you have any questions, now is a good time to throw them in the chat. Otherwise, my dear colleague Jessica, who's wonderful, will follow up after this and send out a documentation follow-up with some resources, which is mainly legislation. We might add some case law to it actually, but you can reach out to us if you have any questions. We have a consulting page where you can ask. You can find information. There's workplace risk assessment templates on our website, wsps.ca. In the search box, just put a hazard assessment. There's a video that shows how to do it. There's actual tools you can use and download and use them for yourself with instructions. So there's lots of resources there. You're welcome. Obviously, we do training and certifications, and we have the Health and Safety Excellence Program, which is a great source of opportunity to support workplaces in their journey towards health and safety excellence and improvement in their health and safety programs. So, anything that you learned that was new today? Was there one thing that you learned that was new? Hopefully you have a better understanding of the distinction between awareness and training. That was the goal. Sometimes awareness is enough where there's a risk to work and information on workers. STS sheet. So if you use a chemical in your business, that chemical, that supplier is required to provide you with a safety data sheet. They used to be called MSDS, Material Safety Data Sheets. That changed a number of years ago. There's some free webinars on our website updating the changes to WHMIS. But if you have the chemical, reach out to the supplier, make sure they provide you an updated SDS sheet, or oftentimes you can find them online just Googling. The best way to do it is have an inventory management system for chemicals. So make a list of all the chemicals that you use in your business. Oftentimes people have chemicals stored that they no longer use, so you want to dispose of those properly. And then with the list that you have for each one of them, make sure that you have a updated SDS sheet. They used to expire every year, or I'm sorry, every 3 years. They don't now. It's up to the supplier to update them. But as part of your inventory management system, at least yearly, you should verify from the supplier. But your suppliers are required to provide you with the SDS sheet on the chemicals they use. This is standard practice. It shouldn't be an issue for any of them. But again, a lot of times if you get the chemical name off of the product, you just Google it, you'll find it as well. Okay, any more questions? Right, so you're using the Excellence Program to develop your policy for health and safety training. That's wonderful, that's great. Thanks, Andrew, you're welcome. Okay, so as I said, there will be some resources that we'll share. This is just an example. Mainly it's links. And again, Jessica will follow up and send that to everybody afterwards. And then, keep in mind that we're here. Our job is to help you, is to support you, to give you lots of resources and support. There is no charge for calling and asking questions and getting clarity on things. That's my job. Happy to help you, happy to support you, help you direct you where you can find more information or give you a number of different options. Thank you. And if there's no more questions, thank you very much for your time today. Have a great day and stay safe, everyone.